So now that we know how to create histograms, we want to learn how to basically create numerical measures that can summarize a data set. So what are the three dimensions on which we might want to summarize a data set? A typical value. What's a typical value for a data set? Spread about the typical value. How spread out is the data? Is it concentrated towards the typical value, or does it really vary a lot? And then skewness, which we've talked about, positively skewed, negatively skewed, or symmetric. So let's do a brief demo without really using Excel functions or Excel capabilities of what we mean by calculating a typical value, spread about the typical value, skewness. The formula is complex, so we won't worry about that. But here we have a simple data set. We've got the numbers 1, 3, and 5. And so for a typical value, we have sort of two measures. We have the average, which you know what that is. You add up the numbers and divide by how many. So the average here, if I have 1, 3, and 5, you add those up, you get 9. You divide by 3, you get 3. Okay. Then we sometimes use the median, as you'll see later, for a typical value. The median is sort of the man in the middle, the data point in the middle. Now that can be a little tricky. So if I have 1, 3, and 5 ordered from smallest to largest, 3 is in the middle. There's one data point below it, one above it, so the median would be 3. Okay, but let's look at this second data set. There are 4 data points, so which one is in the middle? The second one has 1 data point below it, and the second data point has 2 above it, so it's not in the middle. The third data point has 1 data point above it, 2 below it, so it's not in the middle. So when we have an even number of data points, basically we average the 2 middle ones. Okay, so for set 2, the median is 3.5. Now there's a third measure, the mode, the most frequently occurring value, but that's pretty easy to do. We usually Excel for that. And that's really not usually what we use to summarize the data set. Okay, now what about spread about the mean? This is incredibly important. So basically, spread about the mean, the measures we usually use are variance and standard deviation. So variance is average squared deviation from the mean. If we use x bar for the mean and xi for the observations, we take every data point minus the mean squared, add those up, and divide. You would think you would divide by the number of data points, but you divide by 1 less. That's a bit complicated to explain, but we'll probably address that in Module 4. Okay, but why do you square the deviations from the mean? Why not just add them up? Well, you can show, if you're good at algebra, for any data set, if you take every data point minus the mean and add them up, you'll always get 0. Okay, you have to square the deviations from the mean so that basically the positive and negative deviations don't cancel out. And then the standard deviation is the square root of the variance. So for the data set 1, 3, and 5, let's go through the calculations, okay? Let's get the variance. So you would take every data point, the mean is 3, we know that. So you take the first data point minus the mean, caret mean squared. Then you take the second data point minus the mean squared. Then you take the third data point, 5 minus the mean squared. Notice those all be positive because when you square minus 2, or when you, that should be minus 3 there, sorry. Now that's the sum of the squared deviations. You divide that by 2. 3 minus 1, because there's 3 data points. Okay, so you have minus 2 squared, that's 4. 3 minus 3 squared is 0. 5 minus 3 squared is 4. 4 plus 4 divided by 2. So you have 8 divided by 2, which is 4. So there is your variance. And then the standard deviation would be the square root of 4, which is 2. Now, basically, if you know the variance, you know the standard deviation, so which one do we use more often? Okay, basically we use the standard deviation is used more often as a measure of spread about the typical value. And the reason for that is the standard deviation has the same units as the data. So if our data is money and it's measured in dollars or euros, I don't know what a dollar squared is, and that's the units of variance. but I do know what a dollar is. Okay, so that's why we often use standard deviation instead of variance as a measure of spread about the mean. Now in our next video, we're going to show you how to install the Grade Analysis Tool Pack add-in into Excel 2016, because we can use that to get a lot of these descriptive statistics that we use to describe a data set.